Mr. Grin, you are the director of the Fondation Jean Monnet, one of the fathers of the European Union. What would Mr. Monnet have to say to the European Union today, and what would he have to say to Switzerland?
Of course, it's never possible to know for sure, because the situation depends on many different things. But what is important is really the values that he had in mind and with which he had worked. And the value, the most important one, is really that Europeans have a common interest, and that the time of war and disaster was much too long, and that it was necessary to create a new era of peace. And these ideas were revolutionary, and they were able to change Europe after 1950. And so what is constant is really the idea that European countries are great states, that they are important for history, for the people, that nobody wants them to disappear, but that it is necessary that they collaborate more closely, and that they take into account the necessity to allow peace, prosperity, democracy, human rights, and a common position of Europe in the world. Because Europe has values, Europe has interests, and if Europeans are weak and divided, they won't mean anything in the new world. And this would be a collective catastrophe. And that's why unity, the common interest, and the way to build Europe with law and democratic institutions, I think, is really at the core of the message, and is still actual and will always be.
In Switzerland, part of the left, and especially younger people who at a certain time were enthusiastic about the European project, today criticize it and see it just as a neoliberal project and just as something that is pushing through the interests of multinational corporations. You have the problem with the Greek crisis, you have the refugees. What would you answer them?
Of course, the European project started with economics, and there was a tendency to abolish barriers, to liberalize. But we know that liberalization between European countries that have similar economic structures can promote intra-industry trade and prosperity and smooth adjustments. The problem comes when opening can be too fast, can be with other parts of the world that are too different. The problem can come when the financial sector becomes too important. And indeed, there have been problems, and Europe and the world are not perfect. But the European project is foremost a political project, a project of civilization, and there is democracy inside the EU. It doesn't mean that it cannot even be improved, but it's a tool, it's a common project, and citizens must take this project and make an appropriation of it. So they must be involved, but it's the same at the level of countries. They must act and participate. And the European project can become more social or more liberal, depending on what one wants. But it's irony when you look at the debate about the European Constitution in 2005. For some people, it was neoliberal, and for others, it was just sheer socialism. So it proves that the truth is somewhere in between, that it is very complex, and it can change. So what I would say is the European project is very important. It is not perfect, but as a citizen and as people being interested in the future for themselves or their children, they must appropriate themselves this project and be involved. And honestly, as a citizen, I wouldn't really care to know that the European project would be liberal or would be socialist. As long as it is democratic, then it's great.
You have worked for both the European Commission as a trainee for some time, and you've worked for the Swiss federal government. And now, one of the things one is hearing all the time about the European Union, it's very bureaucratic. Knowing both systems, is this justified, this idea?
Of course, my experience in Brussels is extremely short and very special. My experience in Bern was wonderful, and the federal service in Switzerland is extremely competent and effective, and this really I could see in the field where I was involved, which is research policy. But to come back to Europe, well, the European civil service is roughly the size of the public service in Paris. It's not nothing, but it's the same as the size of a large city. So the numbers are not that huge. The legislative burden is sometimes criticized. I guess things could be improved, and the new Commission also is changing this. But we must remember that the Commission cannot decide on legislation. It is the Council of Ministers and the Parliament. So MEPs have a direct democratic legitimacy, and the states are represented with their national elected members of government. So it means that if things have to be changed, it's not just because of Brussels, a distant bureaucracy. Things are more complex, and sometimes it's also that countries see the need and they want to act together, and sometimes it's difficult to go back home and say, okay, we've made a compromise, we've gained some things, we've made some sacrifice. It seems to us that on average it's good for everything. It's not that popular. It's so much easier to say, we went to Brussels, we fought hard, we had to defend your interests. That's what we did, and we got everything because we are good politicians.
I see. At the moment, Switzerland has the problem that the National Conservatives around Mr. Blocher have won a votation that wants to limit the immigration and also the limit of immigration from people from the EU. Now, Mr. Blocher is saying that the bilateral treaties we have with the European Union are not so important for Switzerland. You are a specialist on the European market. What is your opinion?
I think as an academic, not at all as a member of the Jean Monnet Foundation, yes, because the Jean Monnet Foundation
has no
political role,
yes,
has no official position. But as an academic, I see that the degree of economic interdependencies between Switzerland and European countries belonging to the EU are very important. It's true that the shares have a little bit decreased over the recent years, but they are still very, very important. When we do imports, I mean, something like 3/4 come from the EU, and for our exports, it's something around 55%. So it doesn't mean that the rest of the world is not important, of course, but it means that we cannot forget Europe or think that we can design another strategy forgetting Europe. So we need access to European markets. It's a matter of national interest. And as citizens, Switzerland has a more traditional view on sovereignty than other countries. And of course, it is right. There is absolutely no problem. But I would just make the observation that sovereignty is a very complex issue, and that you can look at nominal sovereignty on the paper, but there is also the essence of true sovereignty that is more and more in networks and shared. And that's why we must preserve, as a country, our economic interests, and that's why we need a strong tie to the EU. And of course, it could be with a membership, it could be with the European Economic Area, it could be, and it is, with the bilateral agreements. Everything is fine, but isolation would not be fine. And when we look at the bilateral agreements, they come from a common will of the two counterparts. It dates back to 15 years ago. It is here. It is important for the country. And now, if Switzerland wants to change the agreement, it is perfectly legitimate. But as I once said, it takes two to tango. So we have a partner. We've made a deal with international agreements, and to get a new deal, we need a common understanding. And that is now what is being discussed. And I can only hope that there will be a good agreement, that everybody will be happy. But isolation is not an option for Switzerland. And we cannot change the rules unilaterally. And we know that the principles of the free movement are very much deep-rooted in the history and the soul of the European Union. And they cannot just be like this dismissed. And even countries inside the EU have also seen this. So in the end, of course, I don't know what will happen. There are many possibilities, but I just think that the key is really not to make the sacrifice of our prosperity. And about sovereignty, there isn't a single and simple answer, but we must just, I think, try to think over and over again about what is sovereignty, to be more enlightened and to make our decisions based on the sound knowledge of things.
Monsieur Grin, merci beaucoup.